Timothy Mitchell, thank you so much for joining us on SCOTONOMICS. Considering the timing of this interview, coming as it does during a severe escalation in hostilities and tensions in the Middle East, we have to say we're exceptionally grateful for you to spend what must be such valuable time with us. Before we hit you with the whole host of questions that we've got around your book, which was a reissue out this year, Carbon, Democracy, Political Power in the Age of Oil. I thought we kind of must start with your thoughts and reflections on what's going on in Gaza and Israel at the moment.
Well, you're right. It's a very difficult time, and it's a horrendous time for the people of Gaza. I mean, there's just news right now as I'm talking to you of a hospital that's been bombed with casualties of 500. It's almost unbelievable what's happening. Though it's also incredible to see the resilience of the people of Gaza and their ability to withstand what they're being faced with, not only right now, but over the decades, in fact, the century or more of the seizing of their land, the dealing with a form of colonialism and loss that's they've withstood for, as I say, decades and decades, and I think they continue to will continue to do so despite the horrific nature. They're victims, but they're not only victims. They're people who are continuing to fight for a better political future.
I'm sure we'll touch on it as we go through some of our questions, but the role of the United Kingdom, Europe, America, our multinational corporations do not sit separate from all of the issues, the historical issues and the current issues in the Middle East. Our thoughts are with everyone affected by the historical events and the current events across the Middle East.
Before we leave Gaza, there's an interesting connection between Gaza and Scotland, which is that in the late 19th century, after the digging of the Suez Canal, it severely affected the economy of Gaza, which had a rich agricultural region, because Gaza in those days was not just the narrow 5-mile strip, but the whole hinterland as well. And it had played a very important part in the pilgrimage traffic going south to Mecca. But with the Suez Canal, the pilgrims started going by boat, and Gaza had to reinvent itself. And it reinvented itself, becoming a major site for the production of barley, which was supplied to the Scottish and English beer industry. And it became the major overseas source of barley for Scottish and English beer drinkers from the late 19th through the early 20th century. So this history goes back a long time.
Well, we're going to tackle the issues that you discuss in your book, and I'm going to try and do it in kind of chronological order, because that's the way that you addressed it in the book. So let's start with the discovery of the kind of transformational power of coal in the UK in the kind of early to mid 1800s. I think that's roundabout where you start in your book. How did the production and control impact the democratic nature of politics in the United Kingdom in the 1800s?
Well, I think the main impact came in the later part of the 19th century. Obviously, coal helped fuel an industrial revolution that began in the early part of the century. But towards the later part of the century, when you had coal used not only in industry, but to generate electric power, is where you see a very significant effect on democratic politics. Because what happens in that period is you get to a point where the entire country becomes dependent on a single source of energy, coal, not only for industry, but for heating and also for electricity. And that dependence on a single source of energy gives workers a power they had never had before, which is the power to shut down an entire economic system. And you could do it through coordinated strikes among coal workers, railway workers who transported the coal, dock workers and power station workers. And that's what became known as the general strike. And it was called a general strike because of its wide impact, but it was really those workers around energy and the supply of energy that could shut down an energy system. And the threat of the general strike was enormously important to the rise of democracy in Britain, of mass democracy. There were forms of democratic institutions before that, but mass democracy dating from the 1880s and onwards was, I think, thanks to coal, not just in general, but specifically because you had that power through the threat of a strike to make political demands that people have been making for decades, if not centuries, but they now had to be listened to because of that ability to interrupt the supply of energy to the whole country. Very hard to do before that, when energy came from so many different sources, from wood, from forests, from animals, from grasslands, and so on. But once it's focused in one energy source, you had that unusual power.
And it was a connected nature, wasn't it? From coals to railways to blast furnaces. And that was almost exclusively a kind of working class conduit of resources. And along that was built power. So, if we look further into the 20th century, do you link the demise of the power of labour to the demise of coal as the kind of predominant energy source in the UK?
Yeah, and I think that was very clearly understood. I mean, we know from later on, from the Margaret Thatcher period, how clear it was that the defeat of the miners was a way of cementing political power of the right in Britain. But long before that, it was realized that opening up a second source of energy, in particular oil, would help weaken that power that came from dependence on a single energy source. And you see that even more clearly perhaps in the United States, where both sources of energy were available. Once you had a second source of energy, first of all, you've got an alternative, and so there's not the same. The energy was coming from further away, so it was much harder. Those connections you were just talking about between coal miners and rail workers and so on, those connections that were built around the very routes that the coal moved, were much harder to organize once a major source of energy came from elsewhere. Harder to build those connections, and the oil itself was carried on ships in tankers, and you could easily reroute a tanker to take it somewhere different if things were interrupted by strikes or other threats. So the rise of oil in multiple ways weakened the kinds of democratic processes that have been made possible through the rise of coal.
You know, you've got in your book at the start, and you say that democracy is not the end result of the growth of carbon-fueled prosperity and freedom, but a political order that seems paralysed by the scale of the threat of fossil fuels represent. You know, so really what you're saying is the advent of oil really has reduced our democratic power.
Yeah, I mean, it's both added this level of threat, obviously, through carbon emissions, and through that dependence on oil, or that constructed dependence on oil. It's added a level of threat to collective life, including democratic collective life, but it also, in that critical period in the middle and later decades of the 20th century, directly weakened those kinds of forces of mass politics that had been earlier built using coal.
Yeah, because of course oil can be shunted along in pipes and also moved by ships, as well, as opposed to men digging coal out of the ground.
Yeah, and being a fluid, you also, as you say, you didn't have to send men down underground to bring it out. So that point on the coal face that was an important place where you could interrupt energy flow is replaced largely by managers on the surface and a much smaller workforce.
This is slightly tongue-in-cheek, because obviously what you would expect from a heterodox economics podcast, but after the discovery of the great resources of oil in the Middle East, a basic understanding of neoclassical economic theory would state that loads of companies piled into the Middle East and they increased the supply. This reduced prices, and then there was a natural level of profit for a large number of companies, and the market system did its magic, and of course everyone was rewarded owing to their marginal productivity. So it was a wonderful story of happiness and shared resources. Is that what happened, Tim?
It isn't. Partly because one of the things that you didn't have that would have made that wonderful story true was you didn't have a market in oil. That was part of the problem, in the sense that nobody could actually tell you what the price of oil was, because most oil changed hands within what emerged as these large integrated multinational companies that produced the oil, shipped the oil, refined the oil, distributed the oil, and so on, and did so through private long-term agreements with the users they were supplying. So there was no known market price of oil in the first place. And of course, the fact that they were able to so much control the supply meant that they could, rather than having some competitive system, work very hard to limit the supply of oil in order to maintain prices that were many, many times the cost of production. When oil was discovered in the Middle East early in the 20th century, it was seen by the oil companies as an enormous threat to the prices they were getting at that point for oil, because it was so cheap to produce there. And a lot of their concern in the right through the first half of the 20th century and beyond was to limit the supply of oil, because there was already plenty coming from the US, from Central Europe and other places, and slow down the drilling, the producing of pipelines, because of the extraordinary levels of profit they were making from existing supplies of oil. So no, there was no free market in oil at any point.
It's a story of cartels, isn't it? And the reduction of supply and the control of supply. And the story is that, you know, the stories that you cover in the book of these companies buying the oil fields and then promising to build a railway that never materializes, and, you know, never actually drilling. And I think in some cases holding the license to fields for 50 or more years.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
To drain the oil out, it was to keep the oil there. I mean, that's fascinating when you look at that. Was that all about maintaining profits? Was there any other motivation for the way that the corporations were acting?
No, it was precisely about maintaining profits. And I mean, corporate profits on the kind of scale that oil companies could make had really never been seen before. So they were protecting an extraordinary source of wealth. And of course, through much of the 20th century, oil companies became by far the largest shareholder-owned companies of any kind. So that was about slowing down the flow, protecting the price. Though they had to work on the other end as well, because you can only go so far in restricting the flow, even when you have cartels and secret agreements among the large oil companies to limit the supply. And the other end was working very hard to build carbon-heavy forms of life to try and increase the demand for the oil. So promoting, driving the building of suburbia, buying up and shutting down, in the US in particular, public transport, local bus companies and tram companies and so on, and generally creating a dependence on oil that is the other side of restricting the supply. And you can work on both ends. You can restrict supply, and you can also work constantly to increase the demand. We tend to think that somehow industrial civilization had a sort of necessary dependence on a certain level of consumption of fossil fuels, but that was never the case. It was engineered, which is part of the reason even today, for example, the US, with a similar standard of living to Europe, uses twice as much carbon energy per capita as Europe. And that is about the engineering of that deliberately carbon-heavy lifestyle, which went further in the US than anywhere else.
Yeah, I mean, Ry Cooder wrote a whole album about how the roads took over in LA and displaced people that lived in LA. And, you know, obviously in the UK, beaching, tore down lots of the railways to encourage the use of the car as well. And it's clear from this profitability from this source of energy that is so rich in energy, so rich in calorific energy. I remember working out how much a car full of people, how much energy it takes to cross a bridge in Scotland and get to the other side. And when you think about that as a person pulling that car and how much energy you would require to do that, it really is such a rich resource of energy. And what you're saying in the book as well, and I really want to reiterate this for our listeners as well, that China and the rest of Asia, Russia, Europe, and other large industrial regions produce roughly similar quantities of greenhouse gases per capita, which is about 8 to 10 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. But in the US and Canada, it's 20 tons. 20, more than double.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an astonishing difference.
Yeah. And spoken about the relationship between the corporations and profit, but I wanted to kind of go into this relationship that you picked up between the corporations and the government. But from the book here, we've got, led by Lord Carlson, there was an idea that Britain was engaged in an imperial struggle with Russia and with Persia. Carlson had warned repeatedly about the dangers of allowing Russia to build a railway to the Persian Gulf. And on taking office, he signed a protection agreement with the ruler of Kuwait to prevent building there over a Russian pipeline or rail terminus. And this was an effort to portray Russia as a military threat rather than a commercial rival. That started, maybe we're saying in the book, like 100 or 120 years ago. Is the relationship changed over that period, Tim?
Yes and no. I mean, later on, after the outbreak of the Cold War, writers tended to look back on that history of sort of Russian expansion and see it as a continuous process that had been a threat all the way through, and talk about the great game between the British Empire in India and the Russian Empire, but often sort of seeing that pass through very Cold War lenses. There were periods of enormous cooperation between British capitalists and Russians before the Russian Revolution. Some of the major investors in Russian oil were British and other Europeans. So it wasn't always seen as a threat. The threat from the point of view of oil interests, some set of oil interests, those already developing oil elsewhere than Russia, was that the Russians, who were, after the US, the biggest oil producers at the turn of the 20th century, would find a way to easily get that oil out to the Indian Ocean and thus to markets in India and elsewhere. And the threat of a railway that would carry that oil was precisely what the British were very concerned about, and taking control of the headwaters of the Gulf through agreements with Kuwait and so on was about preventing that export of oil, rather than some sort of larger and eternal imperial rivalry. So that gets reproduced again in the Cold War in another way, because part of the impetus of the Cold War is doing everything you can to stop the Soviet Union from exporting oil. It remained a very large oil producer, and the threat to the oil companies was that it might go ahead and do that thing that they'd so carefully prevented happening, which was to create an oil market by actually selling oil at lower prices. And the threat of communism was the threat of bringing into being an oil market.
Moving on a little bit then, and still kind of focusing on the Middle East, you cover in the book the fact that there wasn't really an oil crisis in 1971 up to 74, I think there, and I think that's fascinating. But before we touch on that, I just kind of wanted to say, you covered it at the start there, but this idea that oil prices just started to be manipulated didn't happen in the 1970s. This wasn't something that OPEC just decided. That we don't really hear that. We think of this there being a market price and everyone was happy, and then all of a sudden it was jacked up. Could we just briefly cover that again? What the Western corporations were doing to maintain artificially high prices?
Yeah. So they were setting a price. So privately and as integrated companies, they could control at what prices oil moved between oil fields and to eventually consumers. But as the 1960s unfolded, they faced the problem of the rise in the Middle East of nationalist governments that wanted to take over the control of oil, and a wave of nationalizations of oil, at first attempted in Iran, but then later in Algeria and eventually in Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere. So they were facing the loss of control of the production site of oil, and therefore the need to try and change the pricing so that more of the money could be made downstream. And that meant not paying the producers less, because they were, as they nationalized the oil, they were demanding more and more, but raising the overall price so that the pie was just that much bigger. And that was driving concern. The higher price would also make it possible to develop new oil regions, Alaska for one, but also the North Sea, where production costs were going to be much, much higher. So there were all kinds of interest in having a higher oil price. The crisis that unfolds in the early 1970s, and then is sometimes called the 1973 oil crisis, was not an argument over the price of oil. It was an argument over taxes, how much these new governments would tax the oil companies. And that tax was based on something called a price, which was a kind of benchmark, which wasn't the actual price of oil. But because it suited people to describe it as a price increase rather than a tax increase, it became seen as this increase in the price of oil. So the actual crisis is much more complicated. There's actually two crises unfolding at once, one over this control of oil, and then it overlaps with the 1973 October War, the Arab-Israeli War of that year, which overlaps with these negotiations. So one of the things I try and do in one of the chapters is, first of all, take apart those two stories. One about the Palestine question, because the Saudis and others had said to the US, we will, if you don't stop being so one-sided and blocking a peaceful solution to the crisis, we're going to embargo oil. That was happening at the same time as this struggle over the actual production and taxing of oil. And it all gets lumped together as something called the oil crisis, which is why I call that chapter The Crisis That Never Happened, because just calling it a crisis is a failure to look at the way in which that political battle unfolded. It's an amazing story.
I wondered if you looked at, the situation here for, where I was brought up in Aberdeen. We obviously are the oil city in the UK. And, I have seen through my lifetime that it's the resource curse that is talked about mainly when people are talking about Nigeria. But actually, we have massive inequality. It's the most unequal. It's the third most unequal city in the UK. So despite the fact that we have this resource on our doorstep, it's not particularly, the wealth is not spread around from it.
Yeah, I must confess that although the book pretends to tell this grand story about the history of oil, it doesn't go into enough detail in specific cases, including that of Scotland. There are ways in which it comes into the story, including the one I just mentioned, that this huge increase in the price of oil in 1973-74 is what makes possible the development of North Sea oil in significant ways. Obviously, that's the starting point of part of that history. There's also the entire question of then the control of those resources. And there's a very interesting comparison I'm sure you're familiar with the control of Scottish oil, which of course isn't even in the hands of Scotland, never mind of the people of Scotland, compared to the Norwegian case, where the profits from oil are much more transferred into public hands. The oil is in the hands of a state oil company, and Norway has become enormously rich on the basis of that in a very different way from the experience of Scotland and even Britain as a whole, with the story of North Sea oil, where it was put entirely in the hands of the private oil companies. The Norwegians thought very hard about how to design that different system. And in fact, one of the leading experts who helped them was an Iraqi oil engineer who had grown up and had dealt with these things in Iraq, and then found himself working in the oil industry, the new developing oil industry in Norway, and helped think out an alternative model for taking oil wealth as a public resource rather than something simply to fund corporate profits.
Yeah, that idea of the resource curse, not the resource, it's how it's managed that makes the difference. And when you look at Norway compared to so many other countries that were oil rich, you see the differences in how that resource was managed and the policies that the government enacted to protect it. This idea that you've got something great, there's no natural law that means you don't of it is how it's designed by the politician. Another fascinating thing I found in the book, and I hope this isn't too kind of tender a topic, but it was some of the examples about the Western governments and their interference in the democratic states in support of oil industry. And there's one example, I think it's a pipeline in Syria, and effectively the Syrian parliament said, we don't want this. So the CIA organized a coup to put someone more favorable in place. Again, these are the stories that, if you read enough, you understand that these things happen, but they're not very close to the surface. Can you think of other examples in the book where people might be really shocked that it's so, these aren't just rumors, these are actual things that happened? Have you any other examples of that?
Well, I mean, the one that's best known is Iran in 1951 to 53, which was the kind of test case for this. So in 1951, Iran, which was the largest producer in the Middle East, nationalized its oil industry. And the Iranian oil workers themselves played a very leading role in driving nationalization and in insisting on the national control of the country's oil resource. And the response of Britain and the US was to organize a military coup and overthrow the democratic government, certainly more democratic than what had existed before or afterwards, that it carried out. And that was celebrated by the CIA. Those who carried out the coup actually wrote books about it soon afterwards because they were so proud of this new power. And they continued to exercise it. The Syrian case is a relatively small one from actually a little bit before that, over the route of the it was over the route of the pipeline coming actually from Saudi Arabia, and the terms that the American-controlled Saudi oil companies, Aramco, wanted for that pipeline as it passed through Syria. It was meant to pass through Palestine, but because of the Palestine war, it was rerouted towards Syria and Lebanon. There were many such stories, whether over the routes of pipelines or over the control of oil itself. The other major case is that of Iraq, where, again, the British and the Americans intervened continually in the mid-60s to destabilize, to overthrow governments. They weren't the only factor. There were also local political forces that often organized and to try and change regimes, but those who were working in the interest of the oil companies received the backing of the British and of the Americans at critical points in the carrying out of those coups. And not just the coups, but then the imprisoning and the executing of the political forces, of the progressive political forces that had been overthrown in the coups. So mass
story of passing on names of the labour unions to the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, I think, which is directly related to, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was actually workers within one of the American oil majors who were doing that. I wanted to talk about your quite strong criticism, I think, of the kind of current economic paradigm and this kind of neoclassical economics. And I want to be sure of that, Tim, because you know what it's like. Sometimes you read a book and you think, oh, I know exactly what, I agree with everything it says. And then you say, that's not what I said. But tell me if I'm right. Because you kind of cover your kind of analysis of the creation of this thing called the economy in the mid-1930s. And I thought this was absolutely fascinating, your analysis of that. Could you give us a kind of condensed view of why you picked up on this and why you thought it was so important?
Yeah, well, I discovered in earlier work I was doing before I was writing about the history of oil that this very surprising thing that no economist wrote about an object called the economy before the 1930s. They used the adjective economic, and they had a lot of other words. They would talk about business, for example. They would talk about forms of material life. They would talk about national wealth. But the economy, in the way we completely take for granted, only comes into being as a key term. I mean, it's introduced in the 30s, but it's not widely used till the 1950s. And it goes with a transformation in which statisticians develop entirely new ways to measure economic life in terms of what we now call GDP, which it dates from the same period and is particularly sort of codified and standardized during the Second World War. So you have this object called the economy, and you have this way of measuring it in terms of GDP that are entirely new and that become the kind of central object of politics very quickly. The economy, GDP, and the growth of GDP. And of course, this is a very particular way of measuring human well-being. And those who invented, the statisticians who invented these measures were very aware of the limits of what they were measuring, that there's all kinds of improvements in life that couldn't be captured by the measurement, and all kinds of costs that were included as if they were improvements in ways we could talk about. The connection with oil is that once you start to organize your political life around the economy and its growth, conceived as the growth of GDP, that not only becomes the goal, the sort of key goal of politics, despite the fact that it's not measuring human well-being very well, but it produces what seems to be this absurdity that we're just going to grow forever, and we're going to grow exponentially because the rate is not a simple rate of arithmetic increase, but is increasing geometrically. And it seems today, as we think very seriously about issues around degrowth, and have been for a long time, absurd that at a certain moment an entire sort of civilization can have decided to organize its central political institutions and futures around a concept of infinite growth. But I think the abundance of energy as these new sources of oil become available, despite the efforts to restrict them, they're still enormously abundant, helps underpin this notion that growth is something that can just happen indefinitely. So the timing in the 1950s of a new economics of growth with the extraordinary increase in the consumption of fossil fuels, and that's true of oil, but fossil fuels in general. I mean, we think of the problem of fossil fuels and carbon as something going back to the dawn of the industrial age, but it's almost entirely something since the 1950s in terms of when most of the carbon has been burned. 80% of the carbon has been burned since the 1950s. Yeah, I was going to say that I like quoting the statistics. So yeah, 80% of all fossil fuels burned since the start of the industrial age have been burned since 1960. Yeah, and I think it was Simon Kuznets that came up with the idea of GDP, and was really warning people at the time. You know, this is a measure, but it's not the only measure. And even this measure you shouldn't trust, because a lot of it is guesswork. We've had to estimate all these figures.
Finishing up on a couple of questions on the climate then, there was a wonderful quote from the book. I've related it, the version I've got is 12 years old, so I've related this again to renewable energy, and you might say I've picked up on something wrong, but the quote is, the building of solutions to future energy needs is also the building of new forms of collective life. And I thought, does this mean that renewable energy must be a social or national enterprise rather than a private one?
I think so. I mean, the point I'm trying to make there, often one sees a sort of much too easy assumption that once we get rid of fossil fuels, because we'll be reliant on more distributed sources of energy, because renewables tend to be more widely distributed, we will therefore be more democratic because our lives won't be controlled by large corporations anymore. But I don't think it's so simple. I mean, before the industrial age, sources of energy were very widely distributed. As I was saying before, animal power, grasslands, woodlands, and so on. That didn't make it more democratic. It maybe made it a less violent form of life because you couldn't organize violence on the scale that became possible with the industrial age, but it didn't make it more democratic. And so, democracy is about the ability to say no, the ability to interrupt the exercise of power, not just to sort of have a voice in some general sense. And that ability to say no has partly been built out of the way energy systems are put together and who controls them and who can interrupt them. And so I think in the design of renewable energy systems, it's a question not just of, if they're distributed in small scale, that means we're by definition better off. It's the question of the control of that distribution, the control of the scale, the control of the profit that comes from that transformation. And that's the kind of issues the book is drawing attention to.
Yeah, no, there's a whole chapter in the book called Sabotage, which is absolutely fantastic, and it really goes back to again who has the power. And the final thing I want to kind of again that I picked up from the book, you say that oil companies were masters at acting out their preference for impeding the development of large new sources of supply. And I was looking at again at the renewable energy and thinking, is this changed? Can we expect the oil companies to start moving much faster towards the development of renewable energy, considering this long history of trying to stymie this type of progress throughout the last century? Have things changed? Can they change? What should we expect?
Well, of course, we know, particularly from the ExxonMobil case, that they've spent a lot of time in recent decades actually working to deny the existence of the climate crisis. The Exxon scientists knew as early as anyone and were actually conducting their own research in the late 70s, early 80s on global warming and knew perfectly well what was going on. And once they communicate that to management in the early 80s, management says, oh, wait a minute, this is bad news. And they begin not continuing with that science, but suppressing it. And that's been now increasingly widely documented, the efforts they went to, the millions and millions of dollars they spent on climate denialist think tanks and science and so on. And I don't think anything's really changed in that respect, certainly with a company like Exxon. What has changed a little bit is that sort of on a PR level, the large oil companies have become more aware of what they're up against with the coming end of fossil fuels, and a small amount of their research and investment has gone into renewables, but it's still, is it 5%, something like that, even for the best of them. And they're still investing in new oil that is completely incompatible with, a livable planet. So, they're not proving themselves in any way to be the solution, though they are a little bit more aware of the public relations issue they're facing.
Yeah. Their investments in renewables has to be much more, much bigger. And I just wanted to mention to our listeners and remind them that we interviewed Ben Franta, who wrote a PhD on this and how the oil companies were, literally hiding the facts about this as well. So that's a really interesting interview to look back on. It's one of our earlier interviews.
How much oil is left?
I just wrote a new preface to the new edition of the book, and I should have those facts and figures right at my fingertips. When I wrote the first edition of the book, we were very much in the age of awareness about the problem of peak oil. It didn't come about quite as the picture was imagined a decade ago because of the development of fracking. But we seem now to be at a point of inflection where oil production is declining. But the peak is coming not so much as used to be thought from the lack of reserves as from the shift to renewables.
Tim, thank you so much for joining us. I recommend everyone to get a copy of the new version. I'm going to have to buy it now just for the preface, I think. Tim, if there's all those extra new figures in it. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll speak to you again, maybe another topic in the future. Thanks for joining us.
The new book coming out in about a year, so maybe we can do it again.
Sounds fantastic. Thanks so much, Tim.
All right. Great talking to you. Bye.
Well, I hope everyone enjoyed that. We've got a date with Tim in about a year's time, so I can look forward to that again with his new book. Kieran, what were your thoughts and reflections after watching that again?
Well, I just wanted to point out to the audience as well. I mean, I'm really glad that you found this book, and it's really, for me, it's so interesting. to understand just how much the coal industry was responsible for our democracy such that it is today. And, you know, I like those kind of anatomical analogies, you know, I sort of think of it as you know, the points where some of these workers were and that the power that they had, but also that those congregational nodes that were exchanges of ideas and thoughts, and that created our democracy. And I think we have to think about that today, especially people that are involved in the independence movement, you know, that's so important. Those regular places to congregate and discuss ideas, it's so important.
Yeah, I think Tim's definition there of democracy being the opportunity to have an effect on what's going on, and to have some power and to have some agency. You know, and he was talking about the general strikes and sabotage, as in a full chapter on that. And that's something that we don't really relate to this idea of democracy, but it is about having power and have your voice heard by the means, the non-violent means that you have. So I thought that was really interesting as well. There was so much going on in the book. It was really difficult. We only had 45 minutes with them. It was really difficult to try and get everything in that we wanted, because there was just so much to cover. And genuinely, you could have had an hour on each of the chapters. It was a fascinating interview. We've had loads of interaction. We're kind of a lot of stuff on renewables, which is really interesting. We've actually asked Tim a couple of questions specifically on renewable energy, and I've left them in our paid for Patreon site. So if you do want to see them, it's £3 a month to join us on Patreon for all of our extended interviews. It was interesting because you could clearly see that Tim was an environmentalist, and that environmentalists come in all shapes and sizes. And then as you were reading the book, there's no kind of hint of that at all. You know, it's not a clear kind of position that he's written this book, but it comes to a very natural conclusion at the end. And he also speaks about this period from 1950 to where we are now. It's just been a unique period in history, fueled completely by the burning of non-renewable, or the use of non-renewable energy, fossil fuel energy. And I think that's incredible as well. We forget that this is such a unique time in our history. So much going on. Well, next week, we're going to come back next week, actually, because we've got a bit of a backlog. We've been really busy interviewing all of our guests. But so we've got an interview next week looking at ecological economics. We've got another good 40-minute interview looking in real detail on what ecological economics is and what impact it's having in the policy space, and also kind of how we can use it to help better understand these kind of planetary boundaries and the understanding of growth and infinite growth. It's a really interesting interview, and we'll have that one for you around about the same time next week. So thanks so much for joining us. Please check out our article in the National tomorrow. Maybe quite a controversial one, so definitely subscribe to the newsletter or read the article in the National tomorrow. It's available from 6 o'clock. Thanks very much for joining us. Karen, will I see you soon?
Yes, indeed you will.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for joining us. Please do like, share, and drop in any comments underneath in the description below. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you hopefully same time next week. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.